Anyway, since you have already started a meeting and I'm joining, I have a few little reflections. I think it's been advertised to you that I'm going to talk about quiet conversion. And in order to make that have some sense, I need to tell you a little bit about my own self. I grew up in a good family. Some of you know my family. I had good parents. I have good relatives. I think at one time I had 7 preachers in my extended family. My father, 2 of his brothers, uncles, all kinds of things. And I don't know how else to say this, but to say that I have lived a very good, clean life. I used to tell people that the list of things I have never done is quite impressive. Never smoked, never drank, never caroused, never been to, whatever the list you want to create, I probably haven't done it. And so as I was growing up, religion, the religion of your childhood never survives to adulthood. It always has to go through a process of review, and you have to adopt it for yourself. That the whole internal function of religious life becomes owned by you. You can't rely on what your parents have done and do for the rest of your life. And so, as I came up through adolescence, I did some thoughtful evaluation of my own religion, and I kept choosing to retain religious belief and to live a circumspect life and to live a life open to God. But I noticed something, and maybe some of you noticed that when I would go to youth gatherings, and back when I was young, there used to be youth congresses and all kinds of things like that. And by the way, I'd invite the rest of you to put your cameras on if you're not afraid. It's nice to see people, but I leave that with you. I noticed something, that when they talked about conversion, they would almost always bring somebody up who had a big dramatic conversion story to tell. And I remember 2 of them in particular. I remember one, I don't remember where it was, but it was a very prominent world youth leader who came, and he regaled us with stories of how he had grown up in a good home and then had gone to live on the wild side for a while. And he told stories about racing motorcycles and running away from the police and raising Cain, and then by some rather dramatic circumstance, he experienced conversion, and like 2 days later, he was headed to go and study theology. And I remember thinking about that. Wow, that's amazing. I don't have any story like that. I don't have a big before and after story. The other one I remember, and Frank, you might remember this, because at Helderberg, and I've deliberately tried to forget the man's name, but when I was there, he was kind of the bad boy of the school, and I have to be careful because some of you might be related to him. But he lived on the edge of things and seemed to be. He was a college student. I was in high school, but in the middle of a week of prayer, and I need to add that because I was a good boy, that I had the responsibility of sitting in the balcony at Anderson Hall taking attendance, and so I would sit up there, take attendance, and we got together for chapel that day, and right about the time the speaker was getting up to speak, this guy, the bad boy of the school, got up. He walked to the side aisle, and I thought he was going to go out the back, but he walked up front. And he went up the stairs, and he walked over to the speaker. Do you remember this, Frank? Maybe you were skipping chapel that day. And he put his arms on the shoulders of the speaker and gently moved him to the side. Well, you understand that created quite a bit of tension. There was no fear of violence or anything, but, it's like, whoa, what's up? And he said, he said to the school, look, fellow students, I have to say something this morning. And he told how the previous night at about 11 o'clock, he was walking down the hallway of the boys' dorm at Helderberg, and he walked by a door on the ground floor where the college students lived. He walked by the door, and the door was open, and a group of students, most of them theology majors, were about to have prayer. It was 11 o'clock at night. They were going to pray and then go to bed. And they called him in. They said, hey, why don't you just come and pray with us? And almost kind of scornfully, he said, well, sure, I can do that. And he went in there and he knelt down and prayed. And to everybody's shock, at the end of the prayer season, this guy prayed. And he prayed a prayer about how broken his life was. He started to weep. And, the session went on for a while as they tried to encourage him. And the next morning he got up to tell this story in chapel. And it left us stunned. I mean, wow, what a story. He could tell the day, the hour, the place, and who was in the room when he came to faith. Okay. And I remember leaving there and walking across the quadrangle there at the quad at Helderberg and walking with a friend of mine and saying, wow, that's amazing. I don't have any story like that to tell. And we began to wonder if we had even been converted, because there's no big before and after story. There's not. My life is not before I was a believer and after I was a believer. It seems like the whole thing has been, and so I remember talking to this friend of mine, and I'm sure some of you know his name if I told you his name, but I'll let him live in silence, in obscurity. We actually voiced to each other that maybe it's better if you go off on the wild side for a while, because then you'll be certain of your conversion. You'll have this big story to tell that, boom, I was a wild and woolly character, and then God got a hold of me, and now I'm back in the fold, and I know I've been converted. And I have to tell you that I'm very grateful that I never took up that idea. I never decided to go and live a wild and crazy life. But the question of my own conversion remained an open question. After I came to the States, I went to college, I studied theology for 4 years. That question was still open in my mind. I mean, I could remember many times when I responded to an invitation to be a believer. I can remember that at Nairobi when I was at Maxwell School. There was a day there when somebody appealed to us. And I remember as a little boy, 12 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old, thinking, yeah, I want to be a follower of Jesus. And I remember in high school, I remember in college, but no big story before and after. And so I actually graduated. I was employed by a conference. They sent me to graduate school, to the seminary. After one term there, I got married to my wife. She moved out and we were living there. And that year, she took a class in which she had to write a paper. And after she'd written the paper, she asked me if I would look it over. And so I said, well, sure, I'll look it over. And so I remember sitting reading that, and it was about John the Beloved, who became John the Revelator. And as I read that article, it had a quotation from the Desire of Ages that absolutely left me stunned. Because a quotation, I don't remember the exact words, but I'll give you my own paraphrase. I was stunned. It said there that the conversion of John took place as day by day he listened to the teachings of Jesus, he watched him in his ministry, and that, well, the general gist is that his conversion was quiet and it took place over a period of time. And that paragraph jumped out of that page and hit me right between the eyes and said, Dave, right there's your story. If I asked you to tell me about the Apostle Paul, you all know the story of Apostle Paul. He got knocked off his horse by a bolt of lightning and went blind, and there were all kind of drama, But what do you know about John? See, until I told you that, you don't know anything about the conversion of John. Now, there's no doubt that he was converted because he was one of the sons of thunder, wasn't he? He was one of the roughened guys. He was one of the ones who, when the Samaritans didn't give him food, he suggested that Jesus call down fire on them. We'll teach him a lesson to be inhospitable. We'll roast him. He was a rough and ready guy. And yet at the end of the Bible, end of Revelation, you see this kindly old gentleman who can write letters out to the church and say, my little children. Now, if I said to you all, my little children, you would say, what's the matter with Dave here? He's acting like a little bit weird. Some of us are older than he is. What's he doing calling us little children? John does that. And I'm convinced that the people who heard that felt, oh, so rewarded and so blessed that this man is calling me his child. Okay? John's life is preserved miraculously. He's the only one who dies a natural death. no doubt that this man was converted. But until I read that statement from my wife's paper, Out of Desire of Ages, I had never known, I had never thought about the possibility of a quiet conversion. Okay. And I've actually used this thought as a sermon. I remember the first time I preached, it was at a camp meeting in Massachusetts. And it was early morning camp meeting, about 7 o'clock in the morning, I preached the sermon with quite a bit of detail. And after that service was over, about 25 people came up the side of the side aisle to quietly tell me, did you hear that word? Quietly tell me, thank you for saying that, because that's my story. And I always wondered if I had really been converted. See, I share this story quite frequently, and I've done it on the college campus where I work here. And it's amazing because every time I talk about it, I find people who had quiet conversions, but they quietly wonder if those conversions were real. See, because there's no big story. And I want to read you something. I have two paragraphs that I found relatively recently, a couple of years ago, from a little book here, What is Human? It's a book by a chemistry professor. He's an Englishman who was teaching in Uganda when he wrote this book, and he's actually comparing humanism and existentialism to Christianity. And I picked this book up. It's a little book. It cost me 50 cents at a used book sale. And, it sat in my office here for, I don't know, probably 10 years. And one day I thought, I need to read that book. And the description he has of Christianity at the end is so fascinating to me. It has blessed me so many times that I've read the third section of this book multiple times. It's all underlined, and I've taken quotations here. But I'm going to read you these two paragraphs because better than anybody I've ever known, this man describes what I'm talking about. So I hope you forgive me for reading, right? He said, for some, the new birth is traumatic, accompanied by great inner conflicts and agonies. Paul's was like this. Conversion for him meant a total reorientation of his values. He had, in effect, to come to the point of admitting that his effort was utterly misdirected and his way of life unhappiness and folly. For a man openly committed to the persecution of Christianity, this was no easy thing to do. The result of his inner struggle was so devastating that it involved a temporary collapse of his very forceful ego, after which he went away alone for a period of time to think out the implications of what had happened to him before. And it was another 10 years before he set out on his intensely active work as a missionary. So what the man is saying here is that the conversion of Paul was so traumatic that it took him 10 years to go and reorient himself and recreate his theology and his understanding of God and reality before he was in a position to go and do missionary work. So very traumatic event. The new birth cannot but be traumatic for those whose attitude has hardened in ways that are unchristian. To deny that one is accepted for half a lifetime and to affirm that one has laughed at or denied is painful and costly. The subsequent adjustments may take years. So that's his paragraph on a dramatic or traumatic conversion. The other part, of course, I like the best because he's talking about quiet conversions. For others, the new birth is so quiet and unobtrusive that it is hardly noticed at the time, although the results that gradually follow are momentous. This is often the case for those who come from Christian homes and feel that faith has been theirs since childhood, and for some who become Christians in adolescence before their personalities have set in some definite mold. There are many Christians who can put no date or time to the new birth, but there is no doubt that it has happened. See, so I don't think I will ever get rid of this book just because of that page. Is that I can put no date, no time, no place to my conversion. My conversion was a quiet one that took place incrementally as I went up through adolescence and into adulthood. And I can tell you where my sense of conversion was finally cemented solidly as an adult. I was already pastoring a church. And I was leading my congregation at a prayer meeting. We were going through the book of Ephesians. And the church had a little kind of an office. I never used it because it didn't have heat. And but I was there getting ready for prayer meeting about a half an hour before the people came. And I remember coming to Ephesians chapter 2, because I used to wonder, why do good people need a savior? If you haven't robbed and pillaged and wrecked around, what do you need a savior for if you're already a good person? And I never voiced that publicly, but I used to think so. I mean, my circumstance is different from the wicked people because, I don't have all those sins. And I was reading a book in Ephesians by John Stott, and he talked about what we call the plight of humanity. He said that in Ephesians 2, the plight of humans is clearly laid out, that we are enslaved. No, we are enslaved. Is that what he said? There's something before. Oh, we are spiritually dead. That normally speaking, we as humans don't have much interest in God. We are spiritually dead. He said we are enslaved by the devil, by the world, and that means the whole of culture that's absent God. And then he says an astonishing thing where we are enslaved by the flesh. And when Paul talks about the flesh, he's not talking about skin and bone. He's talking about human nature, even the physical makeup of ourselves, that even our biological drives can enslave us. And if you've ever tried to break a bad habit, you understand how a element of your biology itself, a love and the need for food can become gluttony. The need for physical affection can become lust. The need for intellectual stimulation can become arrogance. All these things grab us. And then he says, lastly, we're condemned. And as I read about that, it suddenly struck me that every human being, even the good ones, the ones who don't have a long list of terrible deeds, are in that situation, spiritually dead, easily enslaved by the devil, the world, and themselves, and they're condemned. And I was a young pastor. I can take you to that church if you want to come visit. I can show you where I went to my knees in that little room, and I thanked God for a savior in a way I had never done before. And so the story of my conversion is long. It goes from the time I was about 10 years old to the time I was about 30 years old. But, at that point, I became a very settled Christian. I am convinced of my conversion. Conversion does some amazing things. It creates a spiritual interest. I think that conversion almost always sharpens a person's conscience. Those are early signs of conversion. And so I invite you to think about this. I don't know if any of you have had quiet conversions. I saw a few smiles on some faces. And I'm not here to denigrate dramatic conversions. I'm glad for any kind of conversion. Dramatic conversions can really turn life into turmoil. Quiet conversions, I think, kind of float into our lives more gently. I do say a little bit to those who have dramatic conversions that sometimes we in the Christian community don't treat you very well, in the sense that we make too big a deal of your conversion, sending you here, there, and everywhere to tell your story. And I've seen some people's conversion experience be spoiled by too much notoriety. But I just invite you to think about that today. I am a happy, contented Christian. I've seen God's hand in my life many times. I am only alive because of providence. I've had several narrow escapes even when I was a child that I attribute to providence. I have spent my life as a minister or a teacher of ministers, and I'm content that my conversion took place and that I try my best to maintain it. And so I would encourage you to reflect on your own conversion, and if it's quiet, it's just as legit as if it was dramatic. So that's my talk, Franks. And now you're muted.
Dave, thank you very much for your talk. Will you answer one or two questions? One or two questions that people have for you. That was kind of funny. We never chatted about that when we were in school together. But that was kind of the questions I had when the guys would stand up in assembly or prayer meeting time and tell their incredible stories and how God's changed them. And I'd sit and think to myself, but that hasn't happened to me. I can't talk that story. Until I read a statement by Mrs. White that she says, better to have a daily experience than to have this dramatic. And that was years ago I read that. I wouldn't even find it now. But there were a few people that wanted to ask questions. So
I'm listening with both ears.
If you want to unmute, you can ask Dave a question or two. And then, Dave, I'm going to ask you if you would close with prayer afterwards.
Yeah. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, I was born in Somerset West, one of the lovely little towns in South Africa. I was born a British citizen. I never lived there. My mother was there to give birth at a hospital because my parents were building Yuka Hospital up in Western Zambia. There was no hospital. And my grandfather was the business manager of Helderberg. So my mother traveled down from Western Zambia to stay with her in-laws. And a few days after she arrived, she went into labor. So it was a kind of close thing. But yeah, I'm listening with both ears.
Laura, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
Laura is from Germany.
Thank you very much for the topic. It was very interesting to me. And I have two questions. The first one would be, do you think the type of conversion you experience, if it's a quiet conversion or not, depends more on your personality type or on the kind of lifestyle you lead? So does it depend on if you are very far away from God in your lifestyle that you kind of experience, how did you call it, a more, one of those conversions where you tell a story about it? Yeah. Or is it more dependent on the personality type you actually have?
I don't think it's tied so much to personality. I do think it's tied to what you've done in life, the way you've lived your life. But I've known people who are very quiet people who've had dramatic conversions.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And the second question would be, do you think knowing about these two different types of conversions should impact the way we do missionary work? Because sometimes I have the impression that the mission work we do is more targeted towards people who should then have dramatic conversions, and we expect them to have dramatic conversions. And because they don't, we kind of don't know what to do with it and don't know how to minister to them.
Yeah, in fact, I'm interested to hear what Frank said. His question was resolved a long time ago. Mine took longer, but because I just never ran into that. But I think there's some substance to what you're saying. Is that I think we need to say a lot more about quiet conversions, especially to young people who've grown up in good Christian homes. They feel like they haven't been converted, and so yeah, I think that we need to. Whenever I talk about conversion now, I talk about both kinds. I never talk about just the dramatic one. So, but yeah, I think it should affect the way we do business. We should recognize and tell people your conversion might be a quiet one, but it will still be a genuine one. So.
I see Bernard Ficker. Bernard Ficker wanted to ask a question.
Hello, Bernard. I haven't seen you in 50 years, sir.
I thought I haven't seen you in 80 years.
Oh, we're not quite there yet.
Not quite there yet. Okay. No, good seeing you. I'm sitting here in Somerset West, where you were born.
Okay.
And not far from the hospital where I assume you were born as well.
I was born in the old hospital.
Yes, no, it's quite close by. Well, thank you for your message. It's really a very important principle to be aware of and to take account of. And I think that it's a matter of growing in grace.
Yes.
You grow in grace and in a knowledge of God, and you're quite correct. Often it is less traumatic to have a traumatic conversion. And there's two stories, and the one isn't better than the other. It's the life we live. So thank you very much. Then, if I may just ask, was Fred Thomas, the business manager of Helderberg, was he your grandfather or what?
Yes.
What's your family lineage?
The Fred Thomas, who was the business manager in the 50s, and he was my grandfather, my father's father. and my grandmother ran the store.
And who's your father?
My father is Fred as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But-
Frederick Herbert and Frederick Malcolm.
And how many names do you have? Do you have also Fred in your name?
No, but my oldest brother does.
Oh.
I imagine some of you know my family, so.
Auntie Betty Staples wanted to ask you something.
Okay.
No, I don't want to ask. I just want to say thank you so much for your talk this evening and your encouragement to arrive at almost 90 years and to be, to feel that in much the same way as you have spoken, and that it's all right, that I don't have to have a dramatic experience. Thank you.
Beautiful. That little speech was worth my time, Auntie Betty. That makes me very happy. Yeah. You've lived a good, long Christian life. Your conversion is sound. It's in good order. So.
Is there anybody else that would like to ask Dave a question? I see Bettina, you want to ask.
Yeah, Bettina,
Yes.
you smiled along the way, so I must hear your story.
No, I'm not telling my story. I just wanted to know, when were you last at Yucca?
Oh, 1993.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, my father supervised the building of Yucca.
Okay. I lived in Mongo for some time, and I visited Yucca. It was our holiday destination.
Oh,
She
wow.
wanted a weekend away.
Yeah, in the early 1950s, when my father and mother went there, it was the end of the road. There was no road to Angola.
Okay.
And they were given a piece of property that the local people thought was haunted. And so at first, nobody wanted to come to the hospital. And my father tells an amazing story, because one day when the hospital was finished, ready to receive patients, nobody would come. And one day, 4 men came carrying an old man on a stretcher who was very ill. And they brought him in, and the doctor looked at him, and his stomach was hard. The man's stomach is pain. And so the doctor said, well, we have to do surgery. And the surgery was very primitive. You know, I mean, they had anesthetic, of course, but they didn't have good lighting. And he did, the doctor, they had prayer there. They did surgery on this old man. And they discovered in his intestine, you know, the marula plant that has all those seeds in it. He had been eating marula's plant, and he had been swallowing the seeds.
Okay.
They took 100 seeds out of his intestine.
Wow.
And then they stitched him up. And of course, you know, intestinal surgery is dangerous. You can get infection. And anyway, within 2 days, the man was obviously recovering. There was no infection. He was sitting in his bed, and the people said, this is a miracle. And so they decided that if the land was haunted, it didn't apply to this, the people running this hospital. And from that day on, the hospital was flooded with people. So that's a story from the early days of Yucca. That
Wow.
if I don't write it down, it will be lost, because my father has passed away now.
Okay. Lovely.
Yeah. Well, people, I'm going to have to say,